Welcome everybody. I'm sorry about we just decided to wait a little bit longer, but we're ready to go now. So welcome to this panel, Reconnecting to Nature. I'd like to acknowledge that we're holding this panel and on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and this is a particularly welcome to country is always important, but I think given the topic of tonight's panel, even more important, because so many of the kind of ideas and traditions of kind of custodianship are going to be discussed tonight. But also being so close to the to Birrarung, the Yarra River, also makes me think very much of very aware that we are on lands that are not ours. Ours, when I say ours, I mean me as a Scottish person historically. My name is Sophie Cunningham, who is Scottish, as I've just mentioned, but I've also written a few books, including a book about the Botanic Gardens, which is how I know Tim Entwisle, and a book called City of Trees, which I think is probably why I've been asked to chair tonight's session. And it is part of the Marshmallow, the sort of events around the Marshmallow Laser Feast, which is, for those of you who haven't seen it, is a really wonderful exhibition. I hope most people have seen it. It's on, I think, until April the 14th, so I really would try and get there. It's, the tagline is, works of nature illuminate the hidden forces surrounding us, revealing the sublime through sensory journeys beyond our everyday perception. But more prosaic way would be described as a multimedia exhibition, but a very moving one. And I, as a tree person, was particularly into the really beautiful sort of images of tree breathing, if you like, the kind of processes of transpiration and just really extraordinary images. Very moving. Okay, so I am joined by Maddison Miller, who's to my immediate right. Maddison is a Darug woman living and working on unceded Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Willumbik. She's an archaeologist, an artist, a writer, and is currently a lecturer at the University of Melbourne, and her research focuses on storytelling as a mechanism for bringing together multiple ways of knowing. She's done some really extraordinary work. You should check her out on the internet, which is how I got to familiarise myself with some of the really fantastic work you've done. Next to Maddison is Tim Entwisle, who's Professor Tim Entwisle, who's an author, botanist and former Botanic Gardens director. He's currently chair of the Harbour Trust in Sydney and the public open space expert panel for the Suburban Rail Loop project in Melbourne. He headed up the Royal Botanic Gardens in Victoria for 10 years, and before that he was at Kew Gardens, and before that he was at Sydney. So he's got a pretty extraordinary wealth of knowledge of these really these public natural places, or sort of natural with some intervention, if you like, the really significant spaces. He's an honorary professorial fellow at the University of Melbourne with a broad interest in algae, plants and public gardens. He's a regular contributor to Australian radio, print and social media, and he's just published a memoir, or recently, called Evergreen, The Botanical Life of a Plant Punk, and that book will be available after the session. And on the far right is Kelly Hertzog. And Kelly, I wrote a book called Melbourne, and as I mentioned, I wrote a book called City of Trees, and all that involved me researching the work that the City of Melbourne were doing, because they're just doing really fantastic work in this field. And so I was very excited, felt a bit fangirly when I realised that Kelly was the person behind so many of the projects that I'd been reading about and thinking about, things like which we're going to talk about, canopy cover and emailing trees, which we may not get time to talk about, but the various projects in which do actually connect people literally to their surroundings. So she leads the urban forest and ecology team at the City of Melbourne. They deliver the urban forest strategy and nature in the city strategy. They're working to double tree canopy cover, cool the city and create thriving urban ecosystems. She has a background in social science and she's passionate about fostering connections between people and nature. So we've got it's a really impressive panel, and which is one of the reasons why I was so pleased to be asked to chair it. And when we were thinking about what we would talk about tonight, I did come across something where Maddison was talking about the idea of country and reading country and the possibility that country in some parts of country are unwell, and asking ourselves questions of how best to care for country and the benefits to us and the land itself. And this care can extend to the managing remnants of the natural world that remain in the city, as well as more constructed natural systems like, say, the Botanic Gardens. And how can we allow these spaces to thrive? So in a way, Maddison's words did sort of gave me a way into the way we could connect the various conversations we're going to have. And I did actually notice that I meant to mention this before the panel, that we're also meant to be touching on art practice, the possibility of art practice, and that is certainly something that I do. We might end up talking about that a bit as well, but we may not have time, I'm not sure. So just to get going, I just had a question for each of the speakers, just to get a sense of their voices and their words, and then we'll kind of lead into more of a discussion. So Maddison, I wondered if you could talk to us about sensory experience of green spaces and how that builds our connection with nature. The reason I thought of asking you this question is because you've done audio work and not just thinking about how things look, but much broader understanding of how we interact with nature.
Yeah, I guess, thank you. So some of my work, my research at the University of Melbourne is having discussions about what does healthy country mean in urban and rural contexts. And part of that is really thinking about the whole sensory experience rather than is there green space, but also, what does healthy country look like and smell like and sound like and feel like, and what are we picturing in this space? And so having those conversations with traditional owners as well as a broader stakeholder community has been really interesting, and some of the threads that are coming out of those conversations are things that perhaps you can't put into a planning scheme but are equally important. So there was things around the return of species into urban space was a indicator of healthy country, and the sound of those, so the sound of frogs or the sound of insects. For a lot of traditional owners, it was the smell of smoke from a campfire or from a cultural burn. It was the sound of children playing in these places. Those were the types of things that were indicators of healthy country, which I think was a really beautiful sensory experience to sort of, imagine what that would be like.
In fact, I realised I didn't say another thing that we'll be linking. What we all talk about tonight is, in fact, the idea we're talking about nature in the city largely, I think. I don't even know if that was part of the brief, but that's certainly how our conversation before this evolved. So, Tim, could you expand a little bit on the importance of green spaces, specifically why they're good for our health and indeed for the planet's health? It's a pretty big question to start with, I realise. But
well, yeah, there's lots of answers to that. And I was interested, Maddie, when you're talking about that sensory experience and having worked in Botanic Gardens, in some ways they're very artificial, very created spaces, but they have plants in them, they have wildlife, they have people, they become, a part of nature, I think, and I like to argue that they are an integral part of the nature we see in urban environments, particularly. So those benefits in a botanic garden are different in some ways to a remnant or a piece of vegetation or some piece of land that's kept a stronger connection to country and has kept a stronger connection to the flora, the indigenous flora. But it can work in the same way. I mean, there are probably a lot of benefits all of you will be familiar with these days, and that's the obvious ones are oxygen and clean air and the fact that plants are needed both in a botanic garden and the city and in our world to help with that ecosystem of, storing carbon and producing the oxygen we need, producing products we use, producing food, all those kinds of things. Then there's this other layer which is getting more attention more recently, I suppose, around health benefits. And those are very broad. We sometimes think of those, there are medicinal plants, and 70% of medicines we use either came from plants or fungi originally, so there's that connection there with very directly with medicine. But more broadly with healing, it's that sense of being with nature, a lot of studies showing the benefits to physical health, the benefits to mental health. The study I really, really love, it came out, I think it was in Europe, might have been Belgium or Netherlands a few years ago. The variety and diversity of plant life makes a place more stimulating and more engaging, and for your mental health more beneficial because there's actually that variety. So if you have a park with a few plane trees and some grass, that's okay, that does certain things. If you have a botanic garden with plants from all over the world or all over Australia or all over Melbourne, whatever you like, that diversity makes captures your eyes, captures your attention, and is a good thing. And I think as a botanic gardens or ex-botanic gardens director, I found that really exciting.
Yeah, in fact, I did a long walk through Japan once, and walking through those plantations, they feel kind of like, even though there are lots of trees and they're beautiful trees, they do feel slightly dead in a way because there's just no biodiversity. I think we'll probably...
Yeah, and it even comes down, I think, to starting to admire the weeds in the paths and the plants wherever they appear. Just being a little bit more open to the fact that it isn't just the planted tree and just the as you say, a forest of trees that will be harvested or something like that. So it's all gradual, though. I think my own view is that kind of getting some greenery in initially is good, and then you start to add layers to that.
There's even been studies that have shown that images of greenery is beneficial, so any sort of nature exposure is good.
Should I add here that plastic plants are okay as well? Because I'll just be provocative, but in hospitals, sorry, I wasn't going to mention this, but in hospitals where you can't bring in living plants, they've even shown that having at least plastic plants makes people think of nature and therefore helps their healing.
Yes, no, I have actually used plastic plants for that purpose. Kelly, I wanted you to talk about the nature of one of the ways in which people in Melbourne and around the world engage with nature is through citizen forestry and citizen science in general. And I wanted you to talk a bit about the way that these can kind of build community and what participants get out of it as well.
Yeah, sure. Certainly we've found that, and I think being local government, it's one of the things I love about my job is we're at this interface between policy and ideas and programs, but also, we've got this really fantastic direct connection with the community, and being able to design programs explicitly for the purpose of connecting people to nature is a real pleasure. And certainly citizen science is one of the things that we find just has so many benefits. It's a win for us as people trying to implement policy and look after trees in the city and look after nature. Data is so important. We need to know what's going on, whether it's information about the health of trees or plants, or whether it is understanding the extent of them, or so many, data points that add value to the work we do. But we can't be everywhere all at once, and so we also have this community, many communities in the city, people who want to be more connected.
Give us a couple of examples of what kind of kind of projects you're talking about.
So the Citizen Forester program is one that we kicked off at the start of the Urban Forest Strategy 2012 or so, really as a way of funneling the enthusiasm that we were hearing from people to be more involved. People didn't want us just to make policies and go away and do it. They wanted us to actually give them a role. And so we've had thousands of volunteer hours over the last decade of folks, from all sorts of different folks who live in the city of Melbourne or work or are students, coming out and helping us to collect information. So it might be, we did, a leaf sampling to understand the genetic diversity of our elm trees so that we could have more diverse population and help to sort of preserve the ones that were a little bit more unique. We've had citizen foresters helping us to do valuations, so actually quantifying the ecosystem services provided by trees all around the city. So the data is really important, but the interesting thing is that through that program, you realise very quickly that the real value of that is the connection that people get to nature through doing what seems like just a data collection activity, actually being out in a park, in a green space. The activity is really just the vehicle for what becomes conversations between different people who otherwise wouldn't have met. And certainly, I think the research supports this, that people often experience a greater connection to nature through activities where they're also connecting with other humans, where there's that shared experience. And so for City of Melbourne, many of our residents live in apartment buildings or don't have that much green space that is theirs. And so providing opportunities for people to come out, meet people who are like-minded, do something that's actually helpful for the city, helps us to do our work, but also they get this great fulfilment of just being in nature.
I think one of the things it does, though, your answer indicates, is just how practical things can make a huge difference, that make a difference.
Yeah,
all around it.
absolutely.
Like, you don't have to be kind of all romantic about what's
that's
involved
right.
in connecting with nature. It's sort of seeing it as a job in a positive sense.
Yeah, and that's meaningful for people. So that's also really important when we're designing these activities, is that it can't be tokenistic. So people don't want to volunteer their time to do something that doesn't provide meaning in terms of the work that we're doing. So it needs to be important, but it also needs to be rewarding for them. So we hold bio-blitzes every couple of years as well, and we get huge amounts of folks. Sometimes we have something really narrow, like we ask people to help us record information about superb fairy wrens in Royal Park, really local and species specific. Other times we've just wanted to understand more about the wildlife in our city. What's here? Who else is here? And we always get such great engagement with those kind of events.
Tim, you look like you have something you want to say.
Well, I was thinking, as an extension of that, someone has just come to Melbourne recently from London. They were looking for community projects, and they were saying they wanted to get involved in something to do with biodiversity in a volunteer program. And I ended up suggesting two things, which were nature strips. And of course, this is becoming a big thing. There's a lovely work, Emma Cutting and the Heart Project in South Melbourne, and where I live in Glen Iris, we've started to do our front nature strip with local grasses. And I was just thinking, it's a small thing. You're not changing the world necessarily, but it's a community thing. You talk to each other, and you're starting to think about. And I think it's the same with the Botanic Garden. It's getting people to actually start thinking about these things and find ways to connect, which is the word. And whether that's through art or whether through a project or whether it's through volunteering, it's making that connection and then taking that one step further.
Yeah. Maddison, can I call you Maddie? What do people call you? Yeah, okay. I had a question here about whether principles of country can be incorporated into urban design, but maybe it might be useful actually to, when I'm using country with a capital C, to maybe talk a little bit about what we're meaning, or you're meaning specifically when you talk about country.
I think that's it's important to sort of say where that is, because I think people might equate country with
the
nature
country.
Or somewhere out there in the bush, and that's not the case. So country is a Indigenous concept that is shared by Indigenous nations around Australia and into the Torres Strait, and it is really, I guess, well, it's everything. Country is not just the land and the waterways, but it's the connection between all things. It's the connection between the plants and the animals. It's the connection between us and the water and the land and the skies. And it is a mnemonic device, memory device. And so that's how we have these stories that are tens of thousands of years old, because country, we say that country holds those memories for us. And I mean, that's sort of what it provides, is this, I guess it's like a giant book, it holds the knowledge of our ancestors, and it holds the knowledge of our future, and it is everywhere, and it is, we are all of us here are part of country, and we all have obligations to country. So when I talk about obligations, that's sort of, that's the underpinning law of country and if you've ever been to a Welcome to Country, and Arnie Joy Murphy-Wandon does beautiful welcomes in the city of Melbourne, and she often says, from the roots of the trees to the tops of the roots in the ground to the tops of the trees, you're welcome to Wurundjeri country. But she also says that while you're here, to walk lightly and to care for this place. And so, things like verge gardens are just such a beautiful example of how we can all fulfill our obligations to care for country. So caring for country in tending, but also in the community sense, is really important. So it's strange to sit in this room and think we are on country right now, but I think that's also a really powerful way to think about how we go about our day, is to think we're always on country and we always have an obligation to care for a place. What does that mean?
And you do, am I right about this? You do work in urban design, getting principles of country into urban design. So as an extension of that,
yep.
Could you explain that concept?
Yeah, so I guess my the work in urban design is really about, so I'm a Darug person, so a lot of my country is heavily urbanised in New South Wales, Sydney region, and how can we build our cities in a way that cares for country? And I think that's a vital question for my community and a vital question for Melbourne as well. So work in Melbourne, my background as an archaeologist, and is largely been sort of in the goldfields or in Melbourne. And in Melbourne, we've seen that there's been significant change to the landscape of Melbourne in a way that you perhaps wouldn't understand as you're walking through the streets. But in parts of Melbourne, the streets have been raised up to 2 metres. The waterways have been covered over. And so that natural flow of water through country here has been disrupted. We go to the Birrarung, which is such a life force for Wurrung and Boonwurrung peoples, and it's got hard edges, and it's really just a channel to get the water out of here, and there's no opportunity for that water to provide nourishment as it has done for millennia really. So I guess I look at urban design, urban planning as an opportunity to recreate our places as places that tend to us and care for country. And really that is so vital. Cities are so vital for the future in thinking about climate change, thinking about how we're going to feed and house and look after our broader community.
Tim, I wanted to ask you, as an extension of the idea of country, where the role that botanic gardens have come to play, because they're they're complicated, they're contested sites, sometimes early in their development. Different parks, gardens will be different. The indigenous plants all get removed, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes they're returned, and all these how you evolve.
Reconcile?
Yeah. So, and I was thinking when Maddison was talking about the Birrarung or the Yarra, the Yarra used to go through the bottom of the gardens, and then it kind of got engineered so it's on the other side now. So there's kind of engineering has really has impacted on the Botanic Gardens in Victoria anyway.
It's a really interesting question for Botanic Gardens these days, because they began as sort of physic gardens or medicinal gardens. They went through a stage of economic botany and a very colonial concept of bringing plants to and from places like Australia to the UK, and then they've moved more into conservation in recent times. And I like to think of them as a combination of lots of different things if I talk about Botanic Gardens. But there's a couple of ways of looking at that. One, that place where the Botanic Garden is, there's a whole lot of new signage and wayfindings being put in the last year or so. And it won some awards recently, so it's very pretty, it looks good. But it was also done in consultation with the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, and also I think Jeffa Grenaway. Yeah, he was guiding the way we did that. And the interesting thing is, I think, is it still points to the rose garden and the herb garden and things like that, but the colours reflect the land and the high points on the land, the low point, the meeting areas. It's very broad, but it's that land that was there before the Botanic Garden, trying to just put that layer on it without sort of changing what the Botanic Garden is there to do, which has some really important things we've been talking about in terms of plants and engaging with nature. It was putting that extra layer on, but trying to embed the whole signage in that. And I thought that was a really interesting way to reflect the land as it was before the Botanic Garden, but also as it still is within the Botanic Garden. And the other probably point I'd make on that one too is that there's a tendency to look at the Botanic Garden as a piece of vegetation, if you like, or plants. Now, one thing I think is really important is to see it as a collection of plants and as a place that is telling lots and lots of stories. But it's not just, if I can say that, a couple of plants that happen to be there. And I was asked a couple of years ago now a question by a journalist, and I was asked by someone in the public first about this, or it was campaigning me really, to why don't we remove the Botanic Garden and reclaim the river and put Indigenous vegetation back, which is a fair question, and I think it's a good one to ask. My response was, and you may have read it if it was in the paper, but I said you'd first knock down the MCG, you'd knock down this building here, you'd knock down the art gallery and the library, and I'd put the vegetation back there because the Botanic Garden has far more other important purposes. You're kind of equating it with one simple element of it, that it's got plants in it, and it's a cultural institution. So I say that, it's obviously a bit of a bandwagon, but I do think we need to look at places like Botanic Gardens as having many, many functions.
Yeah. So, Kelly, I wanted to talk, for us all to talk, but you specifically to talk about the urban forest and the importance of trees, which now these are some stats I found on the City of Melbourne site, so they might need, I'm not sure how current they are. I think they're pretty current. So there's 70,000 council-owned trees. That's in the City of Melbourne, is that right?
80,000 now, okay. But we've been busy, but yes.
Right, okay. Worth around 650 million, and at some point I wouldn't mind talking about the ways in which it's useful to think about the economic worth of things, even though it can also operate against some of the other values we're discussing. And there was also a quote there, we expect to lose 27% of our current tree population in the next decade, 44% in the next 20 years. So I was could you maybe talk about the Canopy project, and this will lead us into a broader conversation as well as about climate change as well, inevitably, I think.
Yeah, sure. The City of Melbourne started thinking about trees in the city differently about 10 years ago, so we're halfway through our urban forest strategy, and it was really brought on by the millennium drought and things that were going on, and those statistics that you refer to there around expected loss of trees were largely a product of that. And, lots of old trees that had been planted and were declining in health, and it was at a time when we were realising collectively how important trees are in cities, climate changing, things getting more challenging in that space. And trees have this wonderful function. They do so many things, like they enrich our lives and, are wonderful in and of themselves, but the ecosystem services they provide are really important in cities. And so we were kind of saying, hey, we want more trees, we need more trees. And actually when we looked, many of them were in a state of, quite advanced decline. So that really set in motion, I guess, the work we've been doing over the last 10 years, which is really to say, what should the future urban forest be? And I think, an important part of that transition has been, recognising that the city of Melbourne has had tree assets for a long time and managed them as assets. But really urban forestry is about bringing together the broader picture. It's about trees, and it's also about people and wildlife and the interaction between all of these things in an urban place. So we've got metrics like doubling canopy cover, and we want to do that because, we know that will provide a certain amount of cooling in the streets, and we know that's really important from a health and wellbeing perspective. But it's so much more of a rich picture than that, and much of the work we do contributes to those targets, but there's also a whole piece around the way that the community kind of interact with them and the benefit we all get from having trees in cities.
Yeah, in fact, I mentioned emails before. There was a project that, you were certainly involved with, is my understanding, about where... And it was set up during the drought so people could say, I think this tree is in trouble.
Yeah,
but people used it for more emotional support reasons.
Created this website, which if you haven't seen it, it's still there. It's a bit of a dinosaur website actually in website terms because it's been around for a decade. And it's, we started that as a way for actually initially to promote workshops about developing precinct plans, so implementation plans for what we would plant where. And we thought, we'll create this map and people can see what trees are around and what species they are and click on them. And, wouldn't it be great if they could tell us if it needed some maintenance? That's all it was. And it's been completely taken over in the most delightful, organic way. And I think it really speaks to this inherent kind of connection that we have with trees. You see... still to this day, more emails than we can keep up with coming in to all of the trees around Melbourne. And sometimes they're about maintenance, but mostly they're about everything else. Might be ruminations on political situations. It's often, you spoke about art before. I think you see I must admit it's a real pleasure and a privilege to dive into that inbox and read the things that people send to trees. Art. We get people who will sketch a tree and send that picture to that tree and express their appreciation in that way, or lots of connection, lots of nostalgia. People send stories of their lives that are linked to particular trees in the city, just to the tree. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I've got an Instagram account and I get lots of messages about I planted this tree when my mother died or when my child was born. Or this is your point about country holding memory, and it's a slightly superficial way of thinking about it, like one generation, but that kind of builds over and over, I think. And the canopy, the kind of relationship with trees does relate to, it's one way of responding for country given the pressures of climate change. I wanted to ask you about climate change, Maddison, and the idea of country being unwell, or whether that may not be how you think about it. You may not think of climate change being about country being unwell, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess, I do think of it as country being unwell, and it's, I guess the health of country is linked to the health of people. There's a really great report about the Great Barrier Reef and the health of the cultural heritage within the Great Barrier Reef, and there's a really great infographic that sort of connects all of the indicators of what makes a healthy barrier reef, the Great Barrier Reef, what makes it healthy. And of course, they were talking about it in the context of its cultural heritage values, because the Great Barrier Reef has, I think, 70 different traditional owner groups. Before it was a reef, it was a hunting ground. So those stories still remain, and there's still connection to the reef through fishing and other activities. And so you normally would think about coral bleaching, and you might think about other types of pollution, prevalence of species, but the things that were indicating the health of the reef were things like kids going to school. It was about the physical health of the community. It was about the ability for community to speak language and to be on country. And so when I talk about the health of country, it's this whole of health, because country can't be healthy unless people are tending it, and we can't tend country if we are not healthy, and we can't be healthy unless country is able to care for us. And so it's this deeply reciprocal relationship. And climate change adds this, really big pressure, and we know globally that it is Indigenous communities that are more adversely affected by climate change. I spent time in the Pacific, and I met people who were climate refugees who had to leave their home in the outer islands and atolls and relocate to the larger islands in Micronesia. So it's not a issue that is sort of happening, but we can't, quantify. It is something that is that we can't see, I guess, but it is a real and emergent issue for Indigenous peoples, to the point where Indigenous peoples are removed from their land because of climate change, and they'll never be able to go back there, and they'll never be able to have healthy country. For us, it is an enormous threat.
Yeah. Tim, I know you've done a lot, certainly Rob, the gardens in Victoria, but in other jobs I assume as well, but you had to think a lot about climate change and the effect they have on public spaces and the challenges for how to manage those spaces. Did you want to talk to us a bit about thoughts or some of the work you've done in that area?
Yeah, and one of the things we think about in the role I've had in Botanic Gardens and similar kind of places, I suppose, organisations, you are, on one hand, you're trying to change the world and get people to respond to climate change and reduce the impacts of climate change, and that's through the fuels they use and all the things we're very aware of. And, we have seed banking, and we go out and try and save plants, and lots of programs to do that. But the flip side of that, or sort of the corollary, or what runs next to that, is looking after the Botanic Garden. And I've argued before how important it is, more important than here in the MCG, I've said. So if that is important, then how do you look after a place like that in climate change to keep it functioning the same way it is, so to still do the things it's doing? That means every time you plant a tree, you have to think about what's the climate is going to be like in 50 or 100 years' time. And so we have started a program where each time we plant a tree, we run it through a bit of a module, and we find out, we know what the temperatures are likely to be if we do nothing, if we do something. Whichever model you look at, there's going to be a change, a drying and a heating, and more days, 13 more days over 35 degrees in Melbourne. So plants will need to be different. And so we look at, in a botanic garden and in a park, you then look, and it'd be the same with the city, you're looking at the function of that tree. And for us, for example, we have an oak lawn. We say, well, look, an English oak is about to die. What are we going to replace it with? An English oak will probably not survive in 50 years' time in Melbourne. So we think, do we want another big shade tree, a deciduous tree, one of conservation significance maybe that has importance, one that is from Europe or one from Mexico? And, we think about the collection and we go through that process. So we've done that in our botanic garden, and we've set up a network internationally of 500 botanic gardens doing the same thing. And that's essentially adapting, recognising that despite all our best efforts, and despite what we'll continue to do as scientists and advocates in the general community, we have to respond to the botanic gardens and look after them. And it's interesting, I should have mentioned before when I was talking about how important the Botanic Garden is, there is some indigenous vegetation along the river there, and it's been replanted out, and it does include a couple of old gum trees. And I was thinking of you, Sophie, that the Lionhead River Red Gum
tree I've got on my arm,
which is on Sophie's arm, is still there and was there before the Botanic Garden. That's a lovely connection to prior to the gardens. But how do we care for that tree? Well, we would obviously not take that tree out, we'll try and care for it, look after it, give it extra water. And so there's a bit of nurturing goes on. Plus there's a kind of dose of realism when a tree does die, what do you do next?
Yeah, you've got the is it the white oak that's sort of been
It's
been left there.
Can I just quickly mention that the white oak I think is a fantastic project because we didn't really plan it. If you go to the Botanic Gardens, you'll see a stump of a white oak which comes from the Americas. It was a 150-year-old oak tree. It died about 3 or 4 years ago, and we thought, look, we'll cut it up, we'll take it away. We do actually turn it into useful implements or make it into furniture, or we put it back on the soil usually, but we thought, what could we do here to reflect the time it's been? So we left the stump there. Andrew Laidlaw, our landscape architect, worked with some local artisans, and we picked up the limbs. They trimmed them, they made them into seats, they sort of turned them into something that was just safer for us, if nothing else, and put them back how they fell. So you can come and reflect on that tree, at the same time planting 3 new oak trees which are climate adapted to Melbourne, and they're from Mexico, California, and Texas, the third one. But they'll be shady, big trees. You'll look at them, you'll think these are beautiful oak trees. So you can sit there now on one of the limbs of the old oak tree. It's rotting, it's got fungi on it. It'll only be there 5 or 10 years. It's temporary, which is a very odd thing to do in Botanic Gardens. We tend to keep them tidy and neat. And I think that you'll see more of that because it's worked so beautifully and people have turned it into their own space.
It's great to challenge people's views, though, isn't it? About, and you see this in the cities, parks and gardens as well. Our Nature in the City strategy is about bringing, biodiversity back into our city, and we know that Indigenous plants are so important for that. They, play this critical ecosystem role, and often the feedback that we get from people is really where the expectation of what a park or a garden should look like. You get a sense of that from the feedback. Sometimes people really resist, something that they might see as being messy. But that could be what makes it really fantastic habitat. We know structural diversity in terms of different plants at different scales, providing different nooks and crannies for different creatures. Like it's, you talked, Tim, about the importance for human mental health from diversity, lots of different plants and animals, but it's so important for animals as well, So we need to challenge ourselves a little bit, and that's one of the fun things we can do is test people, push them.
To talk about biodiversity, I know that, but also the idea of mess is interesting, I think, because there's, my brother is a scientist, and there was a project he worked on some years ago about trying to discourage farmers from cleaning everything up, leaving fallen trees, leaving the kind of remnants of, hedgerows. You wouldn't really call them hedgerows, but that kind of old plantings, because that's where a lot of the native bees lived. And just one of the things you can do to just improve the situation for the insect population is keeping those spaces. But the cleaning up is it's quite stressful watching people clean up all the time, because in that mess there's a lot of beautiful stuff in the mess.
There's a great example in the UK, Great Dixter Garden, which I haven't visited recently, but they've done exactly that. It used to be a very sort of formal garden and beautiful English-style garden, if you like, and they're leaving stuff around. They're encouraging biodiversity, and they've got more biodiversity now in their garden than the surrounding kind of paddocks and things, and they're very proud of that. And I think it is about leaving mess. It's about... But then it's what people like to see. And we, in this oak sort of installation, I guess you could call it almost, we began by putting daffodils in because we'd had daffodils in the oak lawn. It's a very traditional kind of planting there under the trees, and we had to get the heritage, I hope there's no one from them here, I had to get Victorian Heritage to approve it, which was fantastic. And they did so. But then we've now, the daffodils looked really stupid next to, in the end, next to this sort of decaying wood. It just didn't look right. And so it's now got grasses and local plants from the local region, and they are messy, and and the rotting wood is messy, and the fungi are quite slimy at times. But that has put something in a botanic garden which was different and challenging for us, even for us as staff as much as for the public.
that sort of leads me into what I wanted to talk to Maddison about, really, is the kind of, you use the word heritage, and this is very complicated, the term heritage. What heritage are we talking about? And so I suppose I wanted to just ask you about biodiversity, but also, I suppose, your feelings about the word heritage, because heritage usually means colonial plantings. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe have I got that wrong? Anyway, that conversation's... And then if people have questions, if people have a think while we're talking about that little issue of heritage and colonial plantings.
I mean, I think, I don't think that colonial heritage plantings are inherently bad. Possums love roses, as many of us have experienced in our gardens. And any plant is better than no plant. Well, maybe not any plant, most plants. But yeah, I guess, I mean, I think that there's definitely colonial attitudes towards nature that have harmed countries. So and biodiversity, so like willow plantings along rivers is sort of the classic example of that. And those types of things that were put in place to serve a function but didn't think about that connectivity, I think that's where the harm comes in. And so, I think you can find biodiversity in many different ways. I think one of the classic ones is biodiversity in cemeteries, is that they are places where lots of very delicate plants can be found because they're not as heavily utilised places, right?
Yeah, and I think that your whole question, Sophie, about heritage is a challenging one for us. And particularly, I'm involved in garden societies, and we're going through a definitional problem at the moment about what a garden is, and they're cultural landscapes, clearly, but cultural landscapes extends to the whole. To me, everything is a culture. And Maddie, I'm sure you might not agree, but everything is a cultural landscape, and in different ways. And gardening is at one extreme of that, and it's highly manipulated usually, and it's creative. But I think they do, when we start to think about heritage, it's a much more complicated thing than perhaps we used to think about, which was, particularly in garden circles, it's the big old rich people's gardens were the heritage gardens.
Yeah. And I'd add, just to quickly add that from an Indigenous perspective, those highly manipulated landscapes are something that have existed here for a long time. Thinking of Budge Bim, highly manipulated lava flows that were used to farm eel intensely. So it's all about balance. It's about having spaces like the Botanic Gardens that are really important, and then having places, where we're letting the wood rot, and it's about that balance and flow of country to allow for all things.
Kelly, I could see you nodding along when we're talking. Did you have any particular thoughts about the whole question of heritage, or?
Oh yeah, look, it's
like. I could ask you how street trees are chosen, but I know that would...
I mean, yeah.
For tree nerds, that's a very long conversation anyway.
All of these things are factored in for street trees. And look, and we have... The climate thing is driving a lot of conversations in terms of heritage and what that means and what it means for landscapes, because we're at a position where things can't always stay the same. Many of the species, like-for-like species replacement is becoming more challenging in those kind of traditional heritage landscapes, places like Carlton Gardens, because some of those species we know won't do so well, already are not doing so well. So it's really pushing these conversations along, and they're conversations we're all collectively having to have at the moment.
I know that there was a conversation about silver birches on the Melbourne Uni campus, because the silver birches, even forget about climate change in general, haven't thrived really in Melbourne the way that some other non-native plants have. Are there any questions? Yes, and I'll repeat the question because there's not a microphone.
Are these policies going out to the rest
The question was about the canopy urban forest strategy and whether it's City of Melbourne or is it a broader...
Yeah, so our urban forest strategy is specifically for the City of Melbourne and focuses on the land we can control, which is the public realm. However, there's most councils in Greater Melbourne and, in fact, across Victoria increasingly have their own strategy, and that will be focused on whatever's more important in those particular areas. So they're all a little bit unique. And then you also have the state government are also thinking about this stuff, and there is a Living Melbourne strategy, which is one that was developed a few years ago, which was an agreement between all of the local government areas within the Greater Melbourne area that agreed on some higher level principles and targets that collectively we all agreed on, and City of Melbourne was one of those, but that was sort of a bringing together of everybody. So there's lots of work going on at lots of scales in this space, and increasingly urban ecology as well. So you're starting to see some really exciting work happening at the city government kind of level in that space as well.
Do we have other questions? Oh, yes.
I noticed there's a Melbourne Conversations coming up on the Green Corridor, is that right? The City of Melbourne are running a thing at Fed Square.
Yeah, the question was about if there's going to be an event with Melbourne Conversations about the green belt, the green...
I think it must be the Green Line. Green Line, is that the one? Yeah. So the Green Line was a pet project, an election commitment from the Lord Mayor, Sally Capp. And so they're getting to the point of actually commencing construction on some of the early stages of that and developing designs for the later stages. So it will start at the Birrarung, sort of in Birrarung Ma, and then extend through the city and really create a green spine, as you called it, a corridor that's more focused around nature, thinking about the river and the edge of the river and attempting to move away from that really hard, harsh, hostile edge, and creating a more civic space, a more natural space, a space for wildlife and people. So, yeah, sounds like it'll be a great conversation.
And in general, the reintroduction of wetlands is a reintroduction of both cultural landscapes, if we use it that word, but also...
particularly that the first stage one, which is Birrarung Ma edge, which is currently like a granitic sand, a little bit of like a stone edging on the waterway, I think. And so particularly the focus of that section, as I understand it, is creating a much more natural kind of edge and blurring that line rather than having that really hard cut off. So I think it'll be a great improvement.
Yeah.
Sophie, can I add to that?
Yes, go for it. Yep.
No, I think the whole idea about talking about corridors and urban forests is really positive, and it's a great way to think of the city as as the houses and the roads are sitting within something else, and that something else is the nature we've been talking about, and I think even just coming back to those, the nature strips and what. They talk about those as corridors too, and one of the big plans there, again, more a community based, this one, but it's from South Melbourne, from Westgate through to the Botanic Gardens, and everyone will do their own little garden, and they can create what they like. It can be geraniums or it can be local poa grasses. It's sort of up to you in a way, but it's just creating that connection. And I know the city is also looking at street trees and ways of fitting into that, but that idea of connection, which is what transfers out into nature, where we're talking about reserves and things being dislocated, and that often causes species to go extinct, and it gives them no room to adapt with climate change. The more we can connect in a physical sense those bits of nature, the better it is for those species, wildlife and plants.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's research that says that small patches matter for biodiversity. So it's a myth to think that you have to have a huge amount of space to make a difference. Actually, the research suggests it's the total quantum. So the total amount, even if it's broken up in little bits, that's what really matters. And sometimes it's those kind of verge garden projects that are more playful, more fun than, a council coming along. We're a bit bureaucratic, it must be said. And so what can be delivered when people kind of just do what inspires them and creates joy for them?
Maddie?
Oh, I was just, I guess, reflecting on that also, is that thinking about that cumulative verge, but also all of this mown grassland that's held by Melbourne Water and other sort of utility companies. That's hundreds of acres that is underutilised, that is not... it's not necessarily that it can't be, it's just that it isn't. And so there's such an opportunity for urban biodiversity in those spaces as well, thinking about how all of our backyards are getting smaller and we're moving into apartments. How are we, as a community, putting pressure on these big public entities to be fostering biodiversity in these spaces?
There's, I think something that's come through in what you've all said is that the connection is both literal, physically we need to connect spaces, but also people connecting to each other to care for country is incredibly powerful. And I was actually thinking, as you were all talking about the Merry Creek, the sort of revitalisation of that over a period, I think, of 20 years of a community group, or 30 years of a people walking and weeding and doing that, and it's a kind of really significant unifier of humans in that part of the world along the creek, but also has obviously benefited the creek. And I do think it's about the idea of connection is just crucial, which is in the title of the talk, I suppose.
Yeah, and it does improve the quality of the water in there and the algae that are growing in there as well.
Oh, yes. Okay. Tim is very keen on algae. Okay, one more question, then we'll finish up. Okay.
And is there a plan to get that into the regulations, whether it's gardens around buildings but also rooftops?
Yeah, the question is about the sort of, for example, at Melbourne University, redevelopments mean that there is appears to be anyway, less green space. And do you have some legislative or kind of any way of dealing with that? I also would quite like to know if you have a view on that, because you work at Melbourne University.
I won't go into too much detail in the interest of time, but it's a tricky space because we can't control exactly what happens there. The City of Melbourne's been working on development of a green factor tool, which is something that can be applied through the planning scheme. It's applied in other cities around the world. We didn't invent this. We're inspired by others in this space. But basically it's sort of a score system where somebody developing a private space is incentivised or required to achieve a certain minimum score. They can do that how they want, but certain things are weighted more highly. So retaining a tree at ground level, an established mature tree, for example, if we decide that that's the best thing that could happen, that might be scored really highly. If there is, Indigenous vegetation on site, keeping that there might be scored really highly. Taking up less footprint and having on-ground green space rather than, building right to the boundary, that might score highly. So rather than prescribing particular outcomes, the tool seeks to give the designers creative control to achieve their score how they want, but it's weighted so that we're kind of nudging them towards particular outcomes. So we're in the process of trying to get that into the planning scheme, which can take some time, but that's one of the tools we can use.
Thank you for your question. I think, it's definitely working on campus in Parkville. My office overlooks the systems garden, so I'm very, very lucky to have such a wonderful place to work. although there's no food up that end of campus now, and I have to go to the new student precinct to get lunch, which is, I'm assuming that's sort of one of the places that you're referring to, in that we aren't, it is quite stark. When I went there, and it's like, oh, where's all the green gone? Because that's one of the gorgeous things about being at the University of Melbourne is the gardens. Definitely. I think part of that development in the second stage, the old engineering building will be turned into the Indigenous Student Centre, and one of the projects is to reintroduce some aspects of the Bouvary Creek into that. So you'll see that in the welcome paving. You can actually walk the former course of the Bouvary Creek in the paving at the new student precinct. And the plan is to have these big ponds next to the new Indigenous Student Centre to invite eels, if they so happen to be travelling through the area, would they like to stop? And so I think that's a really interesting and novel way. And even if no eel ever stops, it is a great provocation as to what was once there, that water that travels through the site, that has been paved over and moves on down into, what would have been Elizabeth Street, and into the Birrarung. So those sorts of connections and those stories can be told in urban design, and hopefully we will see more greenery.
I'm afraid we could keep going for a long time, but I think we do have to finish. So we're really lucky to be here with such amazing speakers. I want to thank Maddison, Tim and Kelly. I also want to encourage, if you haven't seen the Marshmallow Laser Feast exhibition, it's really fantastic. Tim's and my books, some of them anyway, I think are going to be on sale in the foyer. But most importantly, you could now move into the seed bomb making activity area, which is just out the front there, and actually make your own seed bomb to either use at home or give to a friend that has one of those grass lawns that you were describing.
Or take it to University of Melbourne and pop it on one of those buildings.
Yes.
Throw it into some of that grassed, transport land. Yeah, maybe.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. Bye.